Greetings. Welcome to Civics in the Academy. This is the first in a webinar series, which is sponsored by the Alliance for Civics in the Academy. My name is Josiah Ober. I'm the chair of the executive committee of the Alliance. I'm joined by my colleagues on the executive committee, Peter Levine and Jenna Storey. And our moderator today is going to be Debra Satz, who is the Dean of the School of Humanities and Sciences here at Stanford University, as well as a professor of philosophy, and indeed a great friend of the Alliance for Civics in the Academy and Civics at Stanford and nationally. So I want to welcome everybody to this seminar, to the webinar. It'll be a series that we'll talk about more as we go forward. The Alliance for Civics in the Academy was founded quite recently, in just January of this year. We began with a small group discussion among some like-minded individuals, like-minded in that we all care deeply about civics, but rather different in our conception of the approach to civics. So our goal from the very beginning was to bring together a group who were diverse in their approach from public and private universities, from red states and blue states, to see if we had something in common that might be worth pursuing. It turned out that at that first convening that we did, we decided to go ahead and try to create something. We ultimately came to the name of Alliance for Civics in the Academy, and we developed a series of basic principles. We'll talk about those for membership, and this is then our first really out there in the public event. Very much looking forward to your response to what we're doing and where we might go. The Alliance is meant to be a membership organization. It's a community of practice. It's open to anyone who is interested in the teaching of civics at the level of colleges and universities. We very much hope that those of you who are not yet members will consider joining. We'll make that possible, and you'll see that'll show up in the chat. So I turn it over to Debra, and once again, thank you, Debra, for moderating this first session.
Sure. It's a pleasure to be here. This is a cause very near and dear to my own heart. And we have 3 of the 4 members of the executive committee with us on the webinar. Mary Clark, unfortunately, could not be here. She's provost and vice chancellor at the University of Denver, but sends her greetings. But we have 3 very, very distinguished and longtime champions of civics education. Peter Levine has been working at this probably for longer than anybody I know, and is the author of multiple books, really making the case for the importance of the civic role of education, in addition to its role preparing students for jobs and for life, also preparing them to be citizens. Josh Ober, my colleague, you've heard from already, is a distinguished scholar of Greek democracy and the founding director of the Civics Initiative at Stanford, which we are really pleased to launch and is part of a whole set of things that are going on at Stanford that we may talk about later. And Jenna Storey is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, also involved in a project, co-chairing a civic thought project between the Institute and Johns Hopkins. She's also out there in the news, writing on behalf of civics, and the author of several books, including The Art of Choosing: How Liberal Education Should Prepare You for Your Life. So really wonderful to have this great group. And I thought I'd just start off by asking each of you how you got interested in this set of issues and whether you think there's something special about now, about why now. There definitely is a kind of buzz right now around civics education. There hasn't been, for those kind of laboring in the underbelly. I think this is a moment where there's lots of national attention and lots of leadership going on. So what got you interested and where do you think we are? Maybe Peter, start with you.
Thanks so much, Debra and everybody. And also the great, I'm looking at the attendee list, which I don't know if people can see, but I can see. And there's lots of fantastic people who've been working on this for decades. I suppose you're right. I've been working on this for a long time and sometimes tired. And also you could hold me responsible for the fact that things aren't going very well since I've been working on it for all these years. But not to go into a long story, I would say I did start as a college student in the 80s being concerned about these issues. And in those days, the main topic that people were discussing was community service and service learning and engagement in the geographical communities around universities, including Stanford and the Haas Center, but also I went to Yale, and the clash between the contrast between an enormously wealthy university and a very poor city, the seventh poorest city in America at the time, was probably the thing that motivated me the most. But then as the years gone by, I've been interested also in K-12 civic education. And I think the framework of service has never really worked for me. And so I think our discussion has to be broader. I think to your last point, so the presenting problems have evolved. So in the late 20th century, the concern was often that people just weren't involved enough, and a best-selling book was Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone, in the sense that people weren't involved. Now people are pretty involved. We've had a couple of elections with the highest turnouts in American history, and people are pretty mobilized. But there's much more concern about either polarization or sort of generally unproductive involvement and conflict. And the last thing I'll say is I've also been, I have a PhD in philosophy with a historical bent. I've always believed in that. My office, I've always believed in kind of books and reading together and people with their heads bent over texts, talking about text. This is part of what the ACA discusses and is about. We'll probably talk about that more. I'm a little unsettled in my own mind about the relationship between civic engagement and reading books. But if nothing else, the ACA is a venue for having that conversation.
Great. Let me just follow up with one thing. You mentioned that you're a little bit uneasy about the framing in terms of service, and I wonder if you could just elaborate on that for a moment.
Yes, partly it's a concern about sort of noblesse oblige and separating the people who can serve from the people who can't. This is particularly problematic in college and especially selective or universities. I think it's less of a problem if you're talking about eighth graders in a public school. So it's partly that, the kind of noblesse oblige thing, but also I guess I like lowercase r republicanism, the notion that we own the Commonwealth together, and we can look each other in the eye and talk about what needs to be done and treat each other with respect. And so service is not a very kind of Republican virtue in that sense. It's about some people helping other people. So it's political enough. I don't mean partisan. I mean not political in the sense of sharing a common political world.
Great. Thank you. Jenna.
Hi. Yeah, thank you, Debra, for the questions. And thank you for moderating this discussion, all of you for your pioneering work in civic education and for inviting me to come along and learn with you over the last several years. It's been a real delight. I'm relatively new to thinking about civic education as a theme. Prior to coming to the American Enterprise Institute in 2021, I was a professor of political philosophy. And so I did think indirectly a little bit about civic education. Together with my husband and some senior colleagues, we founded a program called the Tocqueville Program. And one of the purposes of that was to help students think about contemporary hot topics with the kind of cooler light of historical and philosophic reflection. So we had a kind of civic angle to our teaching there. But I hadn't really thematically thought about university level civic education until about 4 or 5 years ago, when my husband and I came to the American Enterprise Institute and started writing a book about liberal education. At that time, we started to actually think about the way that many people today see a tension or even an opposition between liberal and civic education. I think, to put that simplistically, You might say a lot of people see civic education as something that should be done in K-12, primarily because it's about pouring knowledge in or inculcating certain habits. And liberal education is something you do later. And liberal education is kind of the opposite. You take those thoughts and habits out of the box, you unpack them, you critique them. As we began to just think about liberal education, we realized that historically, people didn't always think of civic and liberal education in that kind of opposition, and began to think about both of those just differently. I think the understanding of liberal education that is, at least commonly accepted in many quarters today has something to do with the way that a lot of people have been seeing their academic vocation, which is to be a social critic, right? And I think this connects to, and I'm not sure about that anymore. I'm not sure the academic vocation is best described as an activity of social critique. And if that's not true, maybe rethinking the relation between civic and liberal education is something, that I'm interested in doing, and I'd love to do with others. I think it's related to the question you asked, Debra, about what is special about this moment and why is civic education coming to be such a topic and a practice right now. Just speculating about the link that I might see, I think people are becoming a little bit tired of always being the critic. I think we have critiqued our society to bits, in a sense. And young people, I find, are just worried that they're not inheriting something that they can really live well within. And so I see at least some hopeful sparks of a sense that we need to think not just critically, but also constructively. What do we have that we can build on? How do we adjust what we have? How do we change what we have in a way that will point toward a kind of better future? So I think that that's what I'd say, and I think I find that kind of spirit animating a lot of the people involved in this alliance.
Great, wonderful. Reflecting on your relation between liberal and civic education, if you think about liberal as coming from the Latin to be free and to be a free person, you can see the immediate tie to civics, right? That we're together, there's no rulers over us. We, the people, are responsible for making our world together, and we have a responsibility in addition to the other, responsibilities we have as individuals and family members. And I think universities pretty much stepped away for a long time from foregrounding the civic aspects of their role. And it's really interesting to see how many universities are trying, and high schools and other parts of the society are trying to reinvigorate this sense of civic responsibility. Josh.
Well, thank you. Yes, I go back to my childhood. My father was very involved with the civil rights movement in the 1960s, and my family was engaged with that. So from an early time, I thought, you're supposed to be worrying about what's happening out there in the country, as well as what's happening in your own life, in your own local community. My education was all in public universities, and that seemed sort of that, what was happening out there in the community and what we were doing was, there seemed to be fairly well integrated. At least I wasn't maybe worrying about it. I was probably then worrying more about getting my own education, as many students are. Eventually, I showed up at Stanford, a very different kind of institution from the ones that I had been educated in, different from my first job, which was at Montana State University, where at that time the motto of the university was not lux et veritas, it was education for efficiency. And basically the idea was you're supposed to become a better agriculturalist or a better engineer. But even at Montana State, there was this idea that we were doing something outside of just the academic world. Anyway, got to Stanford and come to find out that it's a fantastic place for giving students a technical education. But there really wasn't much going on in terms of anything else. And then come to find out the university's charter basically mandates some kind of civics education. The blessings of freedom is exactly what it says it's supposed to be teaching. And so, well, Debra, you and I became frustrated at a certain point that the university seemed to be drifting further and further from any idea of teaching anything beyond a good technical education. And so we presented a memo to the president saying, get with the program. We're in violation of our charter. We should be doing this. So it seemed to be sort of natural. It was, after all, what American universities back in the day seemed to be at least somehow engaged with, had then lost the bubble, as it were, and ought to get back to it. And so one thing led to another, and we created a civics initiative at Stanford, and then thought we should be talking to people nationally because there's all this other work that's going on. So yeah, I think we're at an interesting moment, a moment in which, at least from the people I talk with on the left and the right, there's a lot of worry about the collapse of some kind of a common thing we're doing together, that citizenship as having something about public goods that we create together, even though we disagree on lots of things. And I think that's the sense, that if we continue to polarize and can't do things together, then democracy is in deep trouble, and that universities, colleges have some role to play in this. Not a unique role. K-12 is absolutely important. The background culture is absolutely important. But if universities and colleges aren't doing our part, then I think there will be real social costs. So.
Great. It's interesting. Stanford itself had a citizenship course that was required following World War I. And I think times of crisis and a sense of, where are we? What are we doing? Why are things not working? Is a time when people often pull together and say, okay, let's reinvigorate, our common destiny and see if we can find a way to work together. So let me shift a little bit to the founding of the ACA, of the Alliance. So maybe, Josh, can you talk about what led you to found it? And, it's not every academic that spends time doing things not directly related to their research and teaching that, in the immediate sense. So what is it that inspired you to really take this on?
Yeah, well, when we got, you and I, Debra, along with help from some other faculty members and some donors who got interested in this, got the civics initiative up and running, we realized it was possible to do this. It could be done at a university. People had for a while said it's simply not possible to create, for example, a course for first-year students that would be a course on citizenship that would be taken by most of the first-year students, which we now have. So having done that, I became more interested in what's happening elsewhere. And come to find out, there were a whole range of other civics initiatives going on. Some had been going on for a very long time. Peters, for example. Other organizations were getting interested in this. For instance, Jenna's. And then there were a number of state legislatures were creating new civics programs, schools, especially in red states, as it were. And the worry then is that there's this energy going on about civic education, but what if it turns into just another front in the culture war? What if we just start fighting about red civic education, blue civic education, private school civic education, public school civic education is simply going to be a loss. So the idea was, is there a way that we can talk with each other across these various differences? So we had some funding and enough to bring together about 25 people from around and about, and Jenna and Peter were there, and said, can we talk across all these differences? No, or really is the difference of opinion about how it should be taught so deep that it's really there's nothing really we can learn from each other across these lines. And it turned out that there was, that we really enjoyed talking about the very different ways that a red state legislatively mandated, publicly supported initiative might relate to something like what we were doing at Stanford, and why it was different, and why it was similar, and what kind of problems that we'd each run into, and what kind of solutions we were trying to come up with. So it was such a sort of a productive meeting that by the end of it, not only had we decided, yes, we should do something. We should create some kind of an organization, and it should be a membership organization that was open to people interested in educating citizens at the level of higher education. And furthermore, we should have some basic principles that we can all agree on. And if we can agree on some basic principles, then we'll have something that's a core. It's not just this sort of generic thing, civics, but civics that would actually mean something, not about the content of what we teach, but in how we teach it. So that was so positive at the end of it that we had sort of, as it were, running room to get going and ask for the kind of funding that would allow us to do more of these convenings, perhaps allow some local plant some local seeds, and we were then off to the races.
Great. Well, thank you. So you mentioned the principles, trying to have a common core of principles. So let me read from your statement of principles, and then I'm going to push all of you on those tell me about why we need something like this. So here are the principles. They're very clear. I'm quoting: preparing students with civic skills, knowledge, and experience relevant to understanding and exercising the rights and duties of citizenship in a self-governing republic is a basic responsibility of American colleges and universities. Faculty must intentionally engage with historically significant competing arguments on contested questions of civic life, oppose indoctrination, and model the democratic values of open inquiry and freedom of expression. Civic education should be a shared intellectual activity grounded in texts, aimed at building a practical capacity for listening and acting together with others, including those of differing beliefs. So very inspiring, but you might say, isn't this just good teaching? Isn't it bad pedagogy not to do this? And
I think, yes, at the end, I mean, that civic education ultimately ought to be just part of the education that a university or college offers its students, and we ought to be modeling, I think, those principles in the courses we teach. Certainly, courses that are involved with value questions. Now, once again, I'm not sure that a course in advanced mathematics that grounded in texts is going to be particularly relevant. But I think, broadly speaking, that's right. But our worry was that in many cases, these basic principles were not being fully followed, that there was a worry that indoctrination was at least being part of the experience of some students. Certainly students I talked with felt that they were not being given in all of their courses, or even in the relevant sorts of courses, any sort of conception of what are the alternative arguments. Jenna was talking about, we get the critical arguments, but what are the positive arguments that these critics are criticizing? And so we thought it was a good thing to put these principles right in the front, because recognizing that some people saw the goal of education rather differently than in those principles, and we ought to just put it front and center that those who were members of this alliance were at least in agreement about these core ideas.
Jenna or Peter, do you have anything to add on
A
this?
couple of quick things. One is I think we're trying to create a space where we can sort of talk together, where peers can talk together about how to actually do these things well. For example, I think almost all the colleagues I can think of in my own university and elsewhere believe we're not indoctrinating and that we have pluralistic syllabi and so on. But when you actually put syllabi in front of a group that's ideologically diverse and talk about what the blind spots or omissions are, you get a very interesting conversation and you get different views. And I say that from experience with the ACA because the second meeting that we had of an ACA meeting was basically focused on looking at actual syllabi. And there are lots of insights to that. So all of us could learn to do it better. And a lot of the biases we have are actually not knowing about things or kind of implicit biases. So I think I'm trying to answer your question by saying, yes, the principles in an abstract way are pretty widely shared, but the practice is relatively difficult, and it needs attention. The other thing is it says I know Josh and probably Jenna too know I'm going to say this because I always say it, but I'll say it anyway. The statement says grounded in texts, and I find that useful, generative. It's also a little bit of a declaration of a focus for this group. So I think when I went to the first conference, I was looking forward to going. They're very distinguished intellectuals and people I wanted to meet. But I was a little worried it was going to be duplicative because I have been in this field for a long time and there are other networks. To me, probably the sort of distinctive aspect of ACA is that it's focused on primarily on the classroom and primarily on texts. Of course, texts are broadly defined. I think there are a lot of humanists in the conversation, but humanists don't own the conversation. I'm haunted by a friend of mine at one of the meetings saying, we social scientists have texts too. And he's thinking not like these texts, but more like the latest issue of the American Political Science Review. But in other words, there's a lot of different kinds of texts, but I think the focus on the classroom and the analysis of things that one reads is central here. And there hasn't been much of in my experience, that's been much of a place where that's been discussed. And so and there's a lot of challenges.
I assume you think the aspect about text is necessary but not sufficient because, of course, you can read text in a very closed-minded way. And, one of the things that's really important here and that I take from your statement is the importance of open-minded curiosity and not, feeling like you're out to just use a hammer to pound, a point of view you already hold, but that you're open to learning.
There's that, and there's also, it's a civic goal of using the text. So I think we're pushing against, ideologically loaded uses of text, but we're also pushing against extremely kind of professionalized uses of text, where the whole point of the text is sort of philology or whatever. It's to apply expertise to unpack the text, and of course I believe in that. But a civic purpose of the text, for one thing, it tends to, most of the syllabi we look at range over quite wide arrays of texts and are not really taught by hyper specialists. So not necessarily taught by people who know the original language, for example. And so I think we're pushing against hyper expertise as well as ideological polarization.
I think I might add just a little bit to that because this is membership and discussions in this group have made me think a little bit more also about the way that we use texts in the history of political philosophy, which I used to teach. You can read those to develop an account of intellectual history. And as Peter says, that's a very valid and good thing to do. But if you're reading them in the context of a civic, if you're reading them for a civic purpose, you should always be asking at some point, how does this help me understand how to make better decisions as a citizen or as a leader here? Or how do we understand the way we're organizing our civic life so that we make decisions in ways that are more fruitful and more pathological? So I think there's a kind of an active element that the same kind of reading can point toward if these texts are read in that civic context.
Right.
Yeah, just a final point is that we found, at least I found in my teaching, that it really helps to have a text about which we can then have disagreement, so that the students can then bring perspectives to the text, but we're debating the meaning of the text, the significance of the text, what we think is valid or invalid in the text, rather than immediately jumping to, well, as I think that, and it's in having the common text to be our point of disagreement, rather than starting from our different perspectives on the world. I think really does help us to get this part of the real skill of being able to disagree in a civil manner, to listen to our fellow students, fellow citizens, and respond to them in a way that perhaps at least they could understand where I'm coming from. But starting with a text rather than starting with a problem is, I think, in many ways, at least pedagogically, I think it gives us some advantages.
Right. One thing, none of you have mentioned what I think of as the most important thing, the most important technology philosophy has ever produced, which is the Socratic method, and teaching by, forcing students to confront, as all of us have limitations in the way we think about things and incompleteness, and putting pressure and getting students to think about, how do I respond to a critic? Even if they're not reading diverse texts, you can take one text and actually, through the Socratic method, really spin out a whole set of different interpretations and different responses. I often say to my engineering colleagues, we have a technology too, and it's really important for citizenship. Maybe I can ask all of you to talk a little bit about the present work of the Alliance, what you're actually doing, what kind of things you're planning. Maybe Peter, start with you, and then move to Jenna.
Sure. So one thing is, I've alluded, I think others have also, to meetings. The meetings have occurred, but we don't want to have a kind of a secret inner circle. So there's actually a process. If you're a member of the Alliance, which I think we'll talk about how to join more concretely later, but it's free, and your people are welcome to join. One thing is, you become eligible then to propose meetings and conferences, and there's several of these have already happened, and there are more on deck. The details are on the website, but in brief, you can either propose a small, low-budget meeting, which is going to be mostly just for your institution, or you can propose a bigger convening. And ACA is subsidizing this. They're paying, although the institution needs to also have some skin in the game. And these meetings have been, a difference in format. The last one was just very recently in University of New Hampshire, and was focused a lot on thinking about public universities and how they can, and less resourced universities, and how they can be involved. I'm actually going to be kind of leading with certainly with colleagues and collaboratively an event in the spring at Tufts, where we'll try to bring together different approaches to civic learning, one of which is dominant in the ACA, which is sort of the classroom and the historical study of big ideas, but two others are sort of more like community service-based, place-based work, and that's the second one. And the third one is kind of heavy research-oriented work on democracy centers and institutes that study the problems of democracy today, and which do involve often students in such work. But I see those as, the proposal. I submitted a proposal. The committee that reviews them is me and Jenna, but I recused. So it was accepted. But the proposal that I wrote suggested that those three those three streams were important streams, that just in terms of the amount of resources and attention that's given to them, and that we should have a conversation where we try to see how they relate to each other. But the bottom line is that if you have ideas for convening, you should join the ACA, and then you should read the instructions, and then you should apply to see if you can convene.
Great. Jenna, do you want to talk about things going on?
Sure. So we have in-person meetings of different kinds, as Peter was talking about. We also are hosting a series of webinars, of which this is the first one. We have scheduled webinars actually for the next academic year, meeting once per month. So roughly, I think the next one is November 12th, and then proceeding after that about in the middle of each month. And they're going to cover certain topics or questions about which our members have a common interest, but different ideas. So in the next meeting, we'll be talking about the possibility of creating a pluralistic framework for civics in higher education. And then we'll have a webinar in December on comparative civics beyond Western Civ, drawing from 3 experts in Chinese politics. And in January, we have a webinar planned on what more selective and less selective colleges can learn from each other regarding civic education.
Great. Josh, any?
Well, just mention beyond what we're doing in convenings and the webinar series, we're trying to build out a resource base of materials that we think are valuable to anybody or potentially valuable to anybody teaching, broadly speaking, education of citizens in universities and colleges. So we have a group of syllabi of courses that are civics relevant, a group of program descriptions of various kinds of civics programs. We also have an ideas page. This is all available on our website that has op-eds, scholarly papers, white papers, opinion pieces. What we're hoping to do is make this into a ever-growing and ever more useful resource base for people who are engaged in instruction in civics. So that we'll talk a little bit more about this later, but this is for our long-term. We want to create the best possible resource base so that anyone who is engaged in a program who wants to do something differently will immediately be able to go to resources for thinking about that. Someone who might be at a college or university that has no civics program at all and thinks it would be great to start something, would then have some resources to get going on it, would be able to find how our programs organized, what kind of courses might be offered, and so on. So, so this is sort of our three sort of big parts: convenings, webinars, and then a resource base. So at the moment, that's sort of the core of what we're up to.
Great. So I want to encourage people to use the chat to put questions to the panelists, and we have a number of questions, so I'm going to start feeding them some of the questions. And not surprisingly, maybe Peter, the first one is, I'd like to hear more about the text focus. What reason do we have to think that textual, relative to, say, empirical, statistical, experimental knowledge, is a privileged way for people to become better citizens?
Right. I think my own answer is it shouldn't be privileged. Actually, that there's several different paths here, and that actually, in fact, the way. So we have a program at Tufts called Civic Studies. It's a major, and it's otherwise a pretty robust program, and it actually has quite a large dose of empirical work. And we're talking about developing a methodology course for that, which we don't actually have, but it'd probably be basically an empirical social science methodology course. So I don't really think my answer is I don't think the text focus is really privileged. I just think it's a focus and a worthy one, and also one in which universities already have an investment because we have humanities and other kinds of adjacent teaching. I think you could probably make a case that if you wanted to, that it is sort of privileged for reasons that Josh especially alluded to, that by having a text in front of us which expresses somebody else's view and does so at some length and some depth, we get out of our own heads and into somebody else's, and that becomes a good starting point for a conversation. So as opposed to a data set where we're not really following someone's train of thought other than our own. I mean, I think a lot of people share this. My great panic about AI is that it's going to kill reading, and the reason it's going to that that's bad is virtual, that reading is a way out of our own brains into somebody else's. So if I wanted to make a case for why I was privileged, I would make that case. But I think I can make a case why other things are also valuable.
Yeah, I mean, one other thing that occurs to me is for some of the statistical and experimental questions, there are right and wrong answers that are single right and wrong answers. And of course, there are right and wrong answers also on civics issues, but for many issues, there are multiple answers that are compelling and reasonable. And training students to see that and understand that is a really important part of living in a diverse world with people who see things differently. Anybody else want to weigh in on this question, or I will move to another question?
I might say something about I agree with Peter that texts are certainly not the only way to engage in civic education. We mentioned knowledge, skills, and experience, first of all, even in our statement, and there's different kinds of knowledge, as you're pointing out, empirical knowledge and so forth. But one thing you get from sort of narrative texts, at least some of the texts we're speaking about, are sort of philosophic accounts of what it means to have a civic life, what it means to be a participating citizen. And these are, people have different ideas about this. And in part, those different ideas about what civic life is go into the shaping of the kinds of questions we even ask in our empirical studies. So I don't think I don't can really engage adequately in the empirical studies without having also some kind of conception of the competing narrative and theoretical frameworks that ground those studies.
Great. Okay, I'm going to turn to another question then. I wonder if the group could speak to the canon question and to the possible ways in which non-Western histories and cultures can be incorporated into civics education.
I can jump off with that because when we were building the Stanford Civics Initiative, we had some funds that allowed us to appoint postdoctoral teaching fellows. We were looking for just the best, most interesting people who are really dedicated to teaching, as well as had the potential to become great scholars and have future careers. As it turned out, one of the first of our teaching fellows, Dongjiang Zhang, who will be on the, I think it's the December webinar, was an expert in Chinese political thought of the late 19th and 20th century. He offered one of our first formally Civics Initiative sponsored courses. And we had to turn away students because there was a great deal of interest in thinking about how does Chinese political thought of the 19th and 20th century relate to Western thought. That was his topic, and so it's not absolutely disjoint that Chinese intellectuals were engaged with Western intellectuals, trying to come up with a way in which what was distinctive about the Chinese thought, the Confucian tradition, was different, but also perhaps had shared some conceptions with the Western tradition. And so that's continued to be an absolutely core part of what we're doing. So I think the point being that we ought to be, yes, there is a Western canon. I teach it. I think it's important, but it's not the only canon we should be concerned with. We should be thinking about how other texts and other intellectual traditions, whether it's Chinese or Indian or whatever, may be of value to those thinking about, broadly speaking, the questions of citizenship and then the questions of what citizenship actually means. So I think that we really need to, at least in the Stanford approach, we don't feel a requirement to make this into Western civilization set of courses, although there are civics initiatives elsewhere that are very focused on the Western tradition. So I think you can do it various ways, but it's not necessarily done in any given with any given specified canon.
Yeah, anybody else want to weigh in here?
It might be worth just saying that these are issues that are contestable within the ACA. I mean, the statements creates a certain outside framework, but this is exactly the kind of thing we probably want to have multiple perspectives on. And another thing is there's the question of the West and other parts of the world, which I actually find conceptually hard to figure out what the West is, but that's just me. But the other issue is the centrality of what people call an American tradition. So there's a fair amount of advocacy for kind of the American tradition as the central focus, and a lot of the new centers that have been created in as one way to characterize it as red states have an explicit focus on something called the American tradition, and I respect that and think it's fascinating, but if and valuable. But if I were really, I could also debate it, because I think that the actual focus should be comparative and global, and that citizenship exists at multiple scales and levels. And so I actually wouldn't, if it came down to which ones you want to do in your place, I wouldn't do an American focus. But I'm glad that we have colleagues inside the ACA who are doing an American focus.
Yeah, right. I think people have different ideas about this topic. I don't think they're necessarily mutually exclusive, and that's one of the things we found in our meetings, right? If you're going to have a comparative civics, you have to have two or more things to compare. So having an American, having some understanding of the American tradition is helpful to compare that to a Chinese tradition or what have you. And I think the question of a canon is in my mind really based in the question of a tradition. The question of the tradition is flexible. It's largely created out of people who are responding to each other and conversing in a way that persists over time, right? So what we really have as part of our canon is our books and texts that have been with us for a long time, because people have found them to be so significant that they've been moved to write something, equally great about them. So I think it's always, worth asking what should be in the canon, but the way I think it gets there is not only studying it and writing about it, but hoping for someone to come along who can write an enduring work about that work, because factually that is how the canon gets created.
Yeah, I'll just share one thing about the Stanford experience. So for many years, I was trying with colleagues to get a common experience for all freshmen that would deal with those civics, aspects of the responsibility of universities. And we never got anywhere because of the canon debates, who would choose what's on the list, and the culture wars. And actually, when we shifted from don't focus so much on what the books are, focus on what the purpose is you're trying to achieve with this common reading, it passed the faculty senate unanimously. So, it was just it was partly, again, a sense of crisis and we have to do something. But it was also, let's not focus so much on the explicit list of books. Let's think about what purposes we're trying to achieve by doing this. I know we have still quite a few questions. I'm going to run through as many as I can, but I want to leave time for Josh to wrap up. So here's a question about how can colleges and universities collaborate with civic education nonprofits who are working in K-12 spaces?
This is certainly something we are really interested in pushing forward on, and we are engaged with, at least various of our members are engaged with K-12 initiatives, and there may be a way downstream, if we can find some further resources, that we can have ACA members develop materials that could be used for K-12 teaching. So that's a hope that we'll be able to do this, because clearly, if we're going to do good university level civic education, it needs to be grounded on a foundation of good K-12 level education. If all we're doing is remedial, then we're not really accomplishing what we ought to be doing. So yes, this is really, in a sense, the future. We've kept it focused on colleges and universities just because there's a very large ecology of work on K-12 civics education, and it's a very complex ecology, and there are very complex problems with it. But we recognize that we need to really be thinking about, as some people have been talking recently, about K-16, right? About all the way through, and hopefully we'll be able to make advances over the next years on that.
Great. There are quite a few more questions, but I'm going to just group. There's a bunch of questions about assessment and evaluation, and how both you would judge success in this endeavor, and also, are you thinking about looking at ways to see whether this has an impact on political polarization? Would that be something you would be interested in studying?
Mm-hmm. I mean, a quick thought is yes. I mean, because it's been part of my sort of the way I've operated in this world is to drive things like assessments and measures. And I think we should think about it with two caveats. One is it always has to sort out the difference between doing things for relatively intrinsic reasons and just instrumental. So, for example, if we're trying to, we measure polarization in standard ways, including just asking people what they think about the other party. And if we're trying to get that number to come down, that may not be a great rationale for a very demanding historical. For example, it may not be a good rationale for studying the difference between Chinese and the interaction between Chinese and Western thought, which, however, is very valuable. And actually, we might be able to get that number to go down in relatively cheesy ways by just telling people to not be so hostile to the other party or whatever. So I'm a little worried about the purely instrumental capture of this. There's some ideals here that are, perhaps they can still be measured. And the other thing is not always convinced that it's the approach that works as opposed to the people. So this is not like a pharmaceutical intervention where you can standardize the production and then see whether it works. It's the people delivering it. So I think a lot of the strategy here is actually around kind of professional development, or you could say human capital, getting people who care enough to want to be part of the ACA to be able to come together and share best practices and stuff. So I'm not sure you can codify the outcomes of that. I suppose we should be hoping that when people are involved with the ACA, they end up being better teachers. So that would be a measurement of the effect on human capital, but it wouldn't be so much that the approaches work. I'm not sure they work. I think they work or don't work depending on how well they're done.
We certainly do we have a bit of a research arm, and we are trying to work on this. But I think, as Peter says, the question of what is your dependent variable is really a real question, and that change in polarization over time would be terrific. But that's going to be only one measure, I take it, of what would really be success in returning, nationally, to a commitment to educating citizens. So.
Great. Well, apologies for the many interesting questions I couldn't get to, but I want to give Josh a chance to talk about ways to get involved.
Yes, well, the registration link for the next event is now, I believe, up in the chat. Tell me if anybody is not finding that. But we'd love to see you here next time. Please tell your friends about this. The more people we have who are part of this, the better, we believe. Please, if you're not a member, please apply for membership. It's straightforward. We basically say yes. It's not a test. We do ask that you agree to the basic principles that Debra read earlier. But we hope that that will be not a hard thing for most people to do. If you're already a member, please nominate for membership. Once again, we've got a nomination form. We'd love to hear about people that are not on this webinar. We need to try to grow this if it's going to be the best possible ACA, if we're to maximize the resources, if we're maximize the value as a community of practice. And Finally, please submit resources and commentary and your research to our ideas page. You just email those to, once again, the site. It's on the chat. The next meeting is going to be out of many one, creating a pluralistic framework for civics in higher education. And it's going to be addressing exactly some of the really hard questions. One more point is that we hope that these webinars from here on in will not be characterized by everybody agreeing. We're trying to get people who actually do have some fundamental disagreements and to model then what the kind of how we can disagree productively about how we're going forward. So although this one brought together 4 people who I think are in very strong agreement about many things about civic education, not everything, actually. We have our own debates for sure. But the goal is to try to get some of the debates out there in public and see if we can't make some progress on that.
Yeah, I love the idea that you're, trying to model, right, the civics education you're trying to create within the organization. I think that's really important.
Exactly so. So just, on behalf of everyone here, I thank you for attending. Peter, Jenna, Debra, it's been great working with you. I just reiterate that it would be, terrific to see our membership continue to grow. It is meant to be a community of practice, and communities of practice work best if we're getting more diverse inputs, if we're getting more constructive dialogue from people who have very different experiences of teaching, who have different experiences of the kind of ecology that you're working within, different kinds of institutions. So the ACA will be a success to the extent to which it is both diverse and that we share our diverse experiences. So please do sign up, get your friends to sign up, and very much hope to see you here next time.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks for the great conversation.
Thank you, Debra.